My uncle laughed in my face when I handed him my resignation. He told me I was nothing but a glorified desk clerk and that I would never amount to anything in his company. I smiled, packed my box, and walked out. Exactly 48 hours later, the Department of Defense rejected his $8.2 million contract. He thought he owned the company, but he forgot one tiny detail. The high-level security certification they needed to win that federal bid did not belong to his firm. It belonged to me. My name is Chloe. I am 32 years old, and until a month ago, I was the director of federal contract compliance at a mid-sized logistics consulting firm in suburban Virginia. For 7 long years, I poured my blood, sweat, and tears into that company. When my Uncle Richard took over the business after my grandfather passed away, it was practically bleeding money. The federal contracts were drying up. The compliance standards were severely outdated, and the firm was just months away from total bankruptcy. Because I believed that family always came first, I stepped up to the plate. I worked 70-hour weeks. I missed holidays. I skipped vacations. I missed my best friend's wedding because I was stuck in a windowless room with Pentagon auditors. I sacrificed my entire 20s to build a compliance department from the ground up, navigating the brutal and complex maze of government regulations to keep the company afloat. Uncle Richard was a traditional, arrogant patriarch. He lived in a sprawling, columned mansion in Great Falls, paid for by the very government contracts I had secured for him. He loved to project the image of the self-made American businessman. He drove a customized Porsche, smoked expensive cigars, and hosted lavish Sunday barbecues for the extended family to show off his wealth. I was always there at those barbecues, usually sitting quietly in the corner, exhausted from working all weekend, to prep for Monday audits. I never complained. I truly believed that my hard work would be rewarded and that my uncle valued my loyalty. Then there was Bradley. Bradley was Richard's 28-year-old son. While I was pulling all-nighters to ensure our cybersecurity protocols met the strict Department of Defense standards, Bradley was out supposedly entertaining clients on the golf course. His expense reports were a disaster of massive bar tabs, luxury car rentals, and weekend trips to Miami. He had no understanding of federal logistics. He did not know the difference between a basic vendor agreement and a classified clearance protocol. Just last year, he lost a massive account because he showed up to a client meeting completely hungover. But he was Richard's golden boy, the heir apparent. For the past 2 years, Uncle Richard had been promising me a promotion. We were bidding on an $8.2 million logistics contract with the Department of Defense. It was a massive game changer for the firm. He told me time and time again that once we secured this bid, I would officially be named Vice President of Federal Affairs. I believed him. I trusted him implicitly. I worked myself to the bone to make sure our bid was flawless. That brings us to the fateful Sunday barbecue. The Virginia heat was thick, the smell of grilled ribs and expensive cologne hung in the air, and dozens of aunts, uncles, and cousins were gathered on Richard's manicured back patio. I was sitting at a patio table, sipping iced tea, feeling a profound sense of pride. We were submitting the final paperwork for the massive federal contract that coming Friday. I thought this barbecue was going to be the moment Richard finally announced my promotion to the family. I had even bought a new dress for the occasion, anticipating a toast to our shared success. Instead, Richard tapped a silver spoon against his crystal glass. The chatter died down. He stood at the head of the long outdoor table, beaming with pride, placing a heavy hand on Bradley's shoulder. "Family," Richard began, his voice booming over the patio. "As you all know, we are on the verge of landing the biggest federal contract in the history of our company. It takes sharp leadership and aggressive networking to swim with the sharks in Washington. That is why I am incredibly proud to announce that my son Bradley is stepping up. Effective tomorrow, Bradley will be our new Vice President of Federal Affairs." The applause from the relatives sounded like physical blows to my head. I sat frozen. The iced tea in my hand suddenly felt like lead. Bradley, who had literally asked me last week how to convert a simple Word document into a PDF, was going to be the Vice President of Federal Affairs. The very position I had bled for. I stood up. I could not stop myself. My chair scraped loudly against the stone patio, silencing the clapping. "Uncle Richard," I said, my voice shaking, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "You told me that position was mine. I have spent the last 7 years rebuilding this department. I put together every single piece of that Department of Defense bid. Bradley does not even know the compliance codes." The silence on the patio was deafening. Relatives stared at me, their eyes wide with shock. Bradley scoffed, taking a sip of his beer, completely unbothered by my distress. Richard's smile vanished. His face hardened into a mask of pure condescension. He looked at me not as a niece who had saved his business, but as a nuisance stepping out of line. "Chloe, lower your voice," Richard said coldly. "You are embarrassing yourself." "I am embarrassing myself," I fired back, stepping closer to the table. "You promised me that executive role, Uncle Richard. I earned it." Richard let out a harsh, mocking laugh that cut through the humid summer air. "Earned it," he sneered. "You do paperwork, Chloe. You check boxes and read regulation manuals. You are a glorified desk clerk. You lack the killer instinct to run an executive department. You are exactly like your father." My breath caught in my throat. My father was Richard's younger brother. He was a kind, gentle high school history teacher who passed away when I was in college. He was a good man, but Richard had always looked down on him for not pursuing corporate wealth. "Do not bring my father into this," I whispered, my vision blurring with angry tears. "Why not?" Richard stepped forward, pointing a finger at my face in front of the entire family. "Your father was a family failure. He had no ambition, no drive, and no money. He died, leaving your mother with a mountain of medical debt. I took you in. I gave you a job. I gave you a salary. You should be down on your knees thanking me for letting you sit at a desk in my building. You will never be an executive, Chloe. You do not have the pedigree for it. Now sit down and know your place." I looked around the patio. Not a single aunt, uncle, or cousin spoke up to defend me. They all just looked away, sipping their drinks, completely complicit in his cruelty. Bradley just smirked and whispered something to his buddy that made them both laugh. In that moment, standing under the blazing Virginia sun, something inside me snapped. The 7 years of loyalty, the 70-hour work weeks, the blind trust in my family, it all evaporated into thin air. I had sacrificed my youth to save a man who viewed me as nothing more than cheap, disposable labor. He truly believed he held all the cards. He believed I was trapped because I needed the paycheck to help support my widowed mother. I swallowed the lump of tears in my throat. My panic and heartbreak suddenly hardened into a cold, calculated clarity. I did not scream. I did not throw my drink. I simply looked at Richard, took a deep breath, and turned my back on him. I walked across the stone patio, through the manicured lawn, and out the front gate without saying another word. As I got into my car and gripped the steering wheel, a calm realization washed over me. Richard and Bradley were planning to submit the final paperwork for the $8.2 million Department of Defense contract on Friday. They were absolutely certain they were going to win it. But they had forgotten how federal compliance actually works in the real world. To even bid on a contract of that magnitude, the government requires a strict cybersecurity maturity model certification, specifically CMMC Level 3. It takes months of rigorous testing, background checks, and exhausting audits to obtain. Richard thought the company possessed that certification. He thought Bradley could simply sign the dotted line and claim the massive federal payout. But he was wrong. The company did not hold that certification. Because of how the regulations were structured when we originally applied, and because Richard had been too cheap to pay for the corporate tier licensing, the high-level credentials were tied directly to the individual compliance officer who personally passed the federal audit. That certification, the sole key to unlocking their $8.2 million payday, did not belong to the firm. It belonged to me. The morning air in Virginia carried a crisp, refreshing breeze that I had not truly noticed in 7 years. It was Wednesday, exactly 48 hours after I had walked out of Miller Logistics. I sat comfortably on the small balcony of my apartment, with my legs tucked under a soft knitted blanket holding a steaming mug of chamomile tea. For the first time in my adult life, I did not wake up feeling like a heavy concrete block was sitting on my chest. I watched the neighborhood slowly wake up below me. People were rushing to their cars, spilling their coffees and stressing about the morning commute. I just took a slow, deep breath and let the warm sunlight wash over my face. Right around 9 o'clock, the automated gears of the federal government began to turn. I knew exactly how the Department of Defense procurement portal operated. The system was designed to be a cold, unfeeling digital fortress. It did not care about Richard's expensive tailored suits or Bradley's fancy country club connections. When Miller Logistics officially uploaded their preliminary bid package for the $8.2 million contract, the portal immediately initiated a routine compliance sweep. The system automatically scanned the company identifier, searching for the mandatory Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Level 3 credential. Because I had officially resigned and severed my professional license from their corporate registration, the system found absolutely nothing. It hit a digital void. In a fraction of a second, an automated email would have been generated and sent directly to the executive suite. The message would be sterile and brutally simple, stating that their company failed to meet the minimum security requirements, and their multi-million-dollar bid was summarily rejected. At exactly 9:14, my cell phone began to vibrate on the glass patio table. The screen lit up, displaying a picture of my cousin Bradley. I did not answer. I simply watched the phone buzz across the table until it went to voicemail. Less than a minute later, it rang again. This time it was Uncle Richard. The phone vibrated violently, a desperate mechanical rhythm that perfectly mirrored the panic I knew was erupting across town. I let it ring again. I took another sip of my tea, savoring the subtle taste of honey and lemon. Over the next hour, my phone received 14 missed calls. I finally picked it up and tapped the voicemail icon. I wanted to hear the exact moment their arrogant illusions shattered. The first message was from Bradley. His voice was laced with that familiar, irritating entitlement. "Chloe, pick up the phone right now. The government portal is locking us out of the submission page. Did you mess with the system settings before you left? Stop acting like a bitter child and fix this immediately. My father is furious. Call me back before we decide to sue you for corporate sabotage." I smiled softly to myself. He still had no idea. He genuinely believed this was just a technical glitch. A minor inconvenience he could bully me into fixing. The second voicemail arrived 20 minutes later. It was Richard. The heavy, booming authority in his voice was vibrating with poorly contained rage. "Chloe, you listen to me. I do not have time for your emotional games. The federal compliance system is rejecting our company profile because your security credential is no longer linked to our registration. You are going to get in your car, drive down here right this second, and reauthorize your certificate. If you cost me this $8.2 million contract, I will ruin you. Do you hear me? I will make sure you are living on the streets." I deleted the messages with a simple swipe of my finger. I felt no fear at all. His threats were entirely empty because the law was firmly on my side. The certification belonged to me as an individual professional, not to his corporate entity. I had paid the continuing education fees out of my own pocket because he had always refused to reimburse me. I was completely within my legal rights to walk away and take my hard-earned credentials with me. By noon, the sheer reality of the situation had clearly settled over the executive suite of Miller Logistics. They could not simply buy a new certification. They could not bribe a federal auditor. It takes a minimum of 6 months of rigorous testing and exhaustive background investigations to earn a Level 3 clearance. The absolute final bid submission deadline was Friday at 5 in the afternoon. They were completely out of time and completely out of options. The tone of the incoming voicemails shifted dramatically. The aggressive, roaring predator had suddenly transformed into a desperate, whining beggar. My phone chimed with the new audio message. Richard sounded out of breath as if he had been pacing frantically around his massive mahogany desk. "Chloe, sweetheart, please pick up the phone." "Okay, look, I understand you were upset on Sunday. Things got a little heated at the barbecue and I said some things I deeply regret. You are not a desk clerk. You are the backbone of this company. Bradley is young and he makes mistakes, but you know how much I value your hard work. Just come back to the office. We can talk about this in person. I will give you the vice president title. I will double your salary. Whatever you want, Chloe. Just please, you have to link your certificate back to our portal. We are going to lose everything. Please call me back." Listening to that pathetic plea, I felt a massive wave of profound disgust wash over me. For 7 years, I had begged for a fraction of that respect. I had worked through weekends and holidays just praying for a simple word of validation. He only offered it when his own personal wealth was on the line. He did not care about me. He only cared about the millions of dollars slipping right through his greedy fingers. I placed the phone back on the table and leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes. I was finally free from their endless toxic manipulation. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a text message illuminated my screen. It was from Sarah. Sarah was a brilliant young compliance analyst I had personally hired and trained 3 years ago. She was the only person in that building I genuinely trusted, and she knew exactly how horribly my uncle treated me. The text message read, "You are an absolute legend. The entire building is shaking right now. I have never seen anything like this in my life." I quickly typed back, "What is happening over there?" Sarah responded almost instantly. "Richard is having a total meltdown in the executive wing. We can hear him screaming all the way down in the bullpen. He literally picked up his favorite ceramic coffee mug and smashed it against the glass wall. There are coffee stains and shattered pieces everywhere. He is throwing chairs around the room and screaming at Bradley." I could visualize the chaotic scene perfectly. Richard, the man who constantly projected an aura of refined, sophisticated control, was throwing a massive temper tantrum like a spoiled toddler. His fragile ego simply could not comprehend that the niece he had publicly humiliated was the only person holding his empire together. Sarah sent another message. "Bradley looks like he is going to throw up." He tried to call a contact at the Pentagon to ask for an extension on the bid, but the officer basically laughed and hung up on him. Everyone in the office is just keeping their heads down and pretending to work, but we all know the $8.2 million deal is completely dead. You took the only golden ticket with you when you left. I am so proud of you for getting out. I smiled warmly at the screen. Reading Sarah's words brought a deep sense of validation to my heart. I was not crazy for leaving. I was not ungrateful. I was simply a woman who had finally opened her eyes to the reality of her own exploitation. I typed a quick reply thanking her for the update and telling her to keep her head down and stay safe. I assumed that the drama was over. I assumed Richard and Bradley would simply have to accept their defeat and face the devastating financial consequences of their own arrogance. I stood up from my patio chair, stretching my arms and enjoying the peaceful quiet of my apartment. I decided I was going to take a long walk through the nearby park and then maybe cook myself a nice dinner. I was ready to leave Miller Logistics in the past and start planning the next chapter of my career. I walked into the kitchen to wash my empty mug when my phone buzzed again. It was another message from Sarah. This time it was an image file. The text attached to the photo was brief and laced with genuine panic. "Chloe, you need to see this right now. I just walked past Bradley's office to drop off some supply chain reports. His door was cracked open and he was not at his desk, but his monitor was fully awake. I took this picture before anyone saw me. They are not giving up." My heart skipped a beat. I set my mug down in the sink and dried my hands on a towel. I picked up the phone and tapped on the image to enlarge it. The photograph was slightly blurry, taken quickly from the hallway, but the contents on the computer screen were undeniably clear. Bradley had completely bypassed my old restricted user profile and accessed the secure corporate server. He had pulled up a hidden folder containing my personal employee records. Open on his desktop was a high-resolution PDF scan of my official cybersecurity maturity model certification document. Right next to it, he had opened a sophisticated digital editing software program. My stomach dropped as I stared closely at the screen. Bradley had isolated my digital signature from an old vendor contract. He was actively trying to splice my signature onto a newly generated corporate authorization form. He was changing the dates on the credential paperwork, trying to manipulate the document to make it look like I was still the presiding compliance officer for their current bid submission. A cold chill rushed down my spine, spreading through my entire body. I had completely underestimated their sheer desperation. They were not just arrogant. They were recklessly, dangerously criminal. Falsifying a federal security credential and forging a signature to submit a multi-million-dollar bid to the Department of Defense was not a simple mistake. It was a massive federal felony. They were planning to submit the bid anyway, using my stolen identity to push the paperwork through the government portal. If the Department of Defense discovered the fraud, the investigation would not just target Miller Logistics. My name, my signature, and my professional license were plastered all over those fake documents. If they submitted that forged package on Friday, I would be implicated in a massive fraud scheme. They were perfectly willing to let me go to federal prison just to save their own bank accounts. I stared at the blurry photograph, my pulse pounding violently in my ears. The peaceful quiet of my apartment suddenly felt incredibly suffocating. The war was not over. My uncle and my cousin had just escalated this from a petty family dispute into a high-stakes criminal conspiracy. I gripped the phone tightly, my mind racing through 100 different scenarios. I could not just sit on my balcony and drink tea anymore. I had to stop them before Friday afternoon, or my entire life would be destroyed. I sat frozen on my balcony, staring at the glowing screen of my smartphone. The chamomile tea in my mug had gone completely cold, but I did not care. I pinched the screen, zooming in on the blurry photograph Sarah had just texted me. The image was taken hastily through the crack of Bradley's office door, but the glowing monitor on his desk told a story so horrifying it made my blood run cold. Bradley was not just trying to figure out a technical workaround. He was actively committing a federal crime. I scrutinized the pixels, my eyes darting across the illuminated details of his dual monitor setup. On the left screen, he had opened a highly secure employee database folder. It was a restricted administrative directory he had absolutely no business accessing. On the right screen, he had Adobe Acrobat Pro open. Staring back at me from the digital canvas was my own handwriting. It was a high-resolution scan of my official wet signature lifted directly from an old non-disclosure agreement I had signed nearly 3 years ago. He was dragging and dropping my signature onto a brand new Department of Defense compliance form. But it was the title typed just beneath my forged signature that made my stomach violently churn. It read, Chloe Miller, Honorary Consultant of Cybersecurity Operations. They were not just stealing my credentials. They were drafting a completely fabricated employment contract to make the Pentagon believe I was still legally bound to their firm. They were constructing a false narrative that I had smoothly transitioned to an advisory role, allowing them to legally attach my cybersecurity maturity model certification level 3 clearance to their $8.2 million bid. The sheer audacity of it was staggering. Submitting falsified documents to the United States federal government is not a simple corporate misdemeanor or a harmless white lie. It is a direct violation of federal law. Defrauding the Department of Defense is a felony that carries severe mandatory prison sentences. The Pentagon does not play games with national security or defense logistics. If they awarded that massive contract to Miller Logistics based on my forged credentials, and a routine audit later revealed the truth, the federal investigators would not just go after Richard and Bradley. The Federal Bureau of Investigation would come knocking on my door. Because my name, my specific clearance numbers, and my replicated signature were plastered all over that submission packet, the government would automatically assume I was a willing participant in a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. My uncle and my cousin were perfectly willing to let me take the fall. If a data breach occurred, or if an inspector exposed the lie, Richard would simply point his expensive, tailored finger at me. He would gladly tell the authorities that his rogue niece had mishandled the paperwork. They were actively framing me to serve as their ultimate scapegoat just so they could line their own pockets with millions of taxpayer dollars. A suffocating wave of panic washed over me quickly, followed by a blinding white-hot rage. I stood up so fast my patio chair scraped loudly against the concrete floor. For 7 years, I had given that family absolutely everything. I missed birthdays. I worked through major holidays. I spent countless sleepless nights stressing over their supply chain vulnerabilities, ensuring every single protocol met the absolute highest standard of federal integrity. I did it all because I believed in the fundamental bond of family. I truly believed that despite his arrogant temper and endless demands, Uncle Richard loved me in his own harsh way. I thought we were a team building a legacy together in honor of my late father. But staring at that photograph, I finally saw the naked, unforgiving truth. I was never family to them. I was a tool. I was an expendable asset to be squeezed dry and thrown to the wolves the very second I stopped being compliant. Richard did not just view my father as a failure. He viewed me as completely disposable. The depth of their betrayal was so profound, it physically ached in my chest. They were sitting in a luxurious corner office right now, casually committing a felony that could destroy my entire future, all so Bradley could afford more weekend golf trips and luxury sports car leases. The tears that had threatened to fall earlier completely evaporated. There was no room left for sorrow or heartbreak. I was dealing with desperate, ruthless men who believed their wealth and country club status made them completely untouchable by the law. I needed to protect myself immediately. I could not just sit in my apartment and wait for the federal hammer to drop on my life. I needed a massive legal shield, and I needed to strike first. I turned away from the balcony and paced across my living room floor. I opened the web browser on my phone and began searching for aggressive defense attorneys in the Washington, D.C. area. I needed someone who specialized in federal whistleblowing and government contract fraud. I needed a legal shark who would not be intimidated by Richard's aggressive bullying tactics or his expensive corporate lawyers. I scrolled through lists of elite law firms, compiling a mental checklist of everything I needed to secure my safety. I had my personal copies of my certification records. I had Sarah's photograph proving the digital forgery in progress. I had the official timestamp of my resignation email securely saved on my personal cloud drive. I had all the ammunition required to prove I was entirely innocent. I found a highly rated federal attorney located in Alexandria, Virginia. The firm specialized in protecting employees who exposed massive corporate corruption. I tapped the phone number on the screen, bringing the phone to my ear to make the call. My heart was hammering a relentless, aggressive rhythm against my ribs. I was preparing to blow the whistle on my own flesh and blood. I was preparing to initiate a legal war that would absolutely tear our entire extended family apart and send my uncle to federal prison. Just as the line began to ring, my phone abruptly vibrated with an incoming call. The attorney's number disappeared from the screen, replaced by a caller ID that made my breath catch in my throat. It was Richard. I stared at the flashing screen for a long, agonizing moment. The frantic, desperate voicemails from earlier in the afternoon had completely stopped. He was calling directly now. The relentless vibrating of the device felt like a physical threat pulsing against my palm. I took a deep, steadying breath and slid my finger across the glass to answer the call. I brought the receiver to my ear, but I did not say a single word. I let the tense, heavy silence hang thick between us. Chloe, Richard said. His voice was no longer loud or frantic. The booming theatrical rage he displayed at the Sunday barbecue was completely gone. The desperate begging tone from his earlier voicemails had also vanished. His voice was chillingly calm, measured, and dangerously quiet. It was the exact menacing tone he used right before he completely destroyed a rival logistics firm in a hostile corporate buyout. "I know you are listening to me," he continued, the cold authority in his words practically freezing the air in my living room. "You think you are very smart, do you not? You think you can just pack up your little cardboard box, walk out of my building, and completely cripple my company. You think you hold all the leverage because of a piece of paper with your name on it. I remained absolutely silent, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a verbal response. My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned stark white. You are going to log into the remote portal right now and reauthorize your credentials. Richard stated his tone, leaving absolutely no room for debate or negotiation. You are going to digitally sign the advisory contract Bradley just emailed to your personal account. We are submitting the bid package at 4:00 sharp, and your name will be on it. I finally found my voice. It came out remarkably steady despite the chaotic storm raging in my mind. You are committing a federal felony, Richard. You are forging my signature to defraud the Department of Defense. I am not signing anything. I am calling a lawyer. A low, dark chuckle echoed through the phone speaker. It was a sound devoid of any warmth or humanity. You can call whoever you want. Chloe. Richard replied, his voice dripping with absolute malice. But I highly suggest you listen to me first. You always were so naive, just like your pathetic father. Did you honestly think I would let you walk away and destroy my $8 million deal without an insurance policy? My stomach plummeted. What are you talking about? I demanded, my pulse racing faster. I am talking about that charming little suburban house your mother lives in. Richard said, slowly drawing out every single syllable for maximum emotional impact. The house your father left drowning in debt before he conveniently died. Do you remember who stepped in and paid off the remaining mortgage to keep a roof over her head? Do you remember who graciously loaned her the money so she would not be thrown out on the street like a stray dog? I felt all the blood rush out of my face. 15 years ago, when my father passed away after a brutal battle with cancer, my mother was left with staggering medical bills and a massive mortgage she could not afford on a part-time salary. Richard had offered to pay off the bank directly. He told us it was a gift to honor his brother's memory. He told my mother she would never have to worry about losing her home. It was not a gift, Chloe. Richard hissed, his voice turning venomous. It was a private loan structured through my personal holding company. A loan with highly specific terms and a lien attached directly to the deed of that property. Your mother signed the paperwork in her grief without reading the fine print. She owes me over $200,000 in principal and compounded interest, and I hold the legal right to call in that debt at my absolute discretion. I could barely breathe. The room started to spin. He had weaponized my father's death. He had kept a secret financial guillotine hanging over my mother's head for 15 years, just waiting for the perfect moment to drop the blade. So here are your options, my sweet, loyal niece. Richard continued, his tone dripping with sadistic triumph. You can log into that portal, sign the advisory contract, and let me secure my federal bid. You get a nice little consulting fee, and your mother gets to keep her beautiful garden. Or you can hang up this phone, try to play the righteous whistleblower, and I will personally call my real estate attorneys. I will initiate the immediate foreclosure of her property before the sun goes down today. I will have the local sheriff drag your mother out of that house and throw her belongings onto the front lawn. The line fell completely silent, leaving his monstrous threat echoing in my ears. You have exactly 30 minutes to sign the document, Chloe, Richard whispered. Do not make me ruin your mother. The call abruptly disconnected, leaving me standing alone in my living room, holding a dead phone. The silence in my apartment felt heavy enough to crush my bones. My uncle had just dropped a bomb on my entire existence, and the fallout was suffocating. I stood perfectly still with the dead phone gripped tightly in my hand, trying to process the sheer magnitude of his cruelty. Richard had not just threatened my career. He had reached into the darkest, most painful chapter of my family history and weaponized my father's death. 15 years ago, when my dad lost his brutal battle with cancer, my mother was left drowning in medical debt and facing the very real prospect of losing the only home she had ever known. Richard had swooped in wearing the mask of a grieving brother and a benevolent savior. He told us he would handle the remaining mortgage to ensure we never had to worry. For a decade and a half, I had looked at him with profound gratitude, believing that beneath his arrogant exterior beat the heart of a man who genuinely cared for his family. I was so incredibly foolish. The loan was never an act of kindness. It was a calculated investment. It was a leash he kept hidden in his tailored pocket, waiting for the exact moment I dared to stop being his obedient servant. Now he was using my mother's sanctuary to blackmail me into committing a federal felony. He gave me 30 minutes to log into the portal and attach my high-level compliance credentials to his fraudulent government bid. If I refused, my mother would be thrown out onto the street. The air conditioning kicked on, blowing a chill across my arms, but the cold I felt was entirely internal. I grabbed my car keys and walked out of my apartment without bothering to lock the door. I could not sit there and let the clock tick down. I had to see her. I had to look my mother in the eyes and tell her that the price of my freedom was her home. The drive through the Virginia suburbs was a blur of green trees and manicured lawns. The afternoon sun beat down on the windshield, but I was shivering. Every mile I drove felt like a march toward an execution. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my fingers ached. My mind raced through 100 different desperate scenarios. Could I take out a personal loan to pay Richard off? No bank would approve a $200,000 mortgage for an unemployed compliance director in a matter of hours. Could I sign the advisory contract and immediately report the fraud to the Department of Defense? That was an incredibly dangerous legal gamble that could easily end with me wearing a federal prison uniform. Richard had cornered me with absolute precision. He knew I would do anything to protect the woman who had sacrificed so much to raise me. My mother was a proud, hardworking woman who spent 30 years teaching second grade at the local public school. She spent her weekends tending to the rose bushes my father had planted before he got sick. That house was not just a piece of real estate. It was the physical embodiment of my family's history. It held the echoes of my father's laughter and the quiet strength of my mother's resilience. I pulled into the familiar driveway and put the car in park. The charming brick house looked exactly the same as it had when I was a child. The porch swing moved gently in the afternoon breeze. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, trying to gather the courage to destroy my mother's peace of mind. I walked up the concrete path and opened the front door. The scent of vanilla and baking spices hit me instantly, wrapping around me like a warm blanket. My mother was in the kitchen, wiping down the counter with a dish towel. She looked up and smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She wore a simple floral blouse, and her silver hair was pulled back neatly. But the moment she truly looked at my face, her smile completely vanished. A mother possesses an innate ability to read the silent language of her child's pain. She dropped the towel and hurried over to me, her hands gently grasping my shoulders. "Chloe, what is wrong?" she asked, her voice filled with immediate maternal alarm. "You look like you have seen a ghost." I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat, forming a massive lump of pure sorrow. I fell into her arms and began to weep. I sobbed with the raw, unfiltered vulnerability of a frightened child. She simply held me, stroking my hair and murmuring soft words of comfort, until the storm of tears finally began to subside. I pulled back, wiping my face with the back of my hand. I guided her to the wooden dining table and we both sat down. I took a deep, shaky breath and told her absolutely everything. I told her about the brutal humiliation at the Sunday barbecue. I told her about Richard giving Bradley the executive promotion I had bled for. I told her about my resignation and the panicked voicemails. I explained how they were actively forging my digital signature to illegally secure the massive federal contract. I laid bare the entire ugly truth of the criminal conspiracy playing out in my uncle's corporate office. My mother listened in absolute silence. Her expression never wavered. She did not gasp or interrupt. When I finally reached the darkest part of the story, my voice broke. I told her about Richard's phone call. I explained the hidden lien on our house and his explicit threat to initiate immediate foreclosure if I did not help him defraud the United States government. "I am so deeply sorry, Mom," I whispered, staring down at the wooden table, completely unable to meet her gaze. I thought I was doing the right thing by walking away. I thought I was protecting myself. I never imagined he would use you as leverage to destroy me. I will sign the papers. I will go back to the office and give them my credentials. I cannot let you lose this house. I expected her to cry. I expected her to panic over the prospect of losing the home she loved so dearly. Instead, a profound and heavy silence filled the kitchen. I slowly looked up. My mother was not weeping. Her face was completely calm, but her eyes were blazing with a fierce, quiet intensity I had rarely seen. She stood up from the dining table without saying a single word and walked down the hallway toward the master bedroom. I sat there confused, wiping the remaining moisture from my cheeks. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a heavy, battered metal lockbox. It was dark green, scratched around the edges, and looked incredibly old. She set it down on the dining table with a solid thud. She pulled a tiny brass key from a chain around her neck and unlocked the metal latch. "My father was a very careful man, Chloe," my mother said, softly opening the lid. "Your Uncle Richard always treated him like a fool because he did not care about chasing wealth or driving luxury cars. But your father understood the fundamental nature of the people around him. He knew exactly who his brother truly was." She reached into the box and bypassed stacks of old photographs and birth certificates. She pulled out a thick manila envelope sealed with aged tape. She opened the flap and extracted a stack of legal documents printed on heavy yellowing paper. She slid the documents across the table toward me. "When Richard offered to pay off the medical debt and the mortgage 15 years ago, your father was already in hospice care." My mother continued, her voice remarkably steady. "Richard brought his fancy corporate lawyers to the hospital room to draft the agreement. He framed it as a compassionate family loan. He told us he was placing the lien under his corporate holding company just for tax purposes. We were grieving and desperate, so I signed it. But your father insisted on having his own independent attorney review the final draft before it was officially notarized." I looked down at the documents. It was the original promissory note from 15 years ago, complete with my mother's signature and the seal of Richard's holding company. The legalese was dense and intimidating, but as a compliance director, my entire career was built on decoding complicated contractual language. I began reading the pages, my eyes darting across the paragraphs of loan terms, interest rates, and foreclosure stipulations. "Read the addendum on page 4. My mother instructed, tapping her finger against the paper. "The attorney your father hired insisted on adding a specific state compliance clause regarding the enforcement of the debt." I flipped to the 4th page and ran my finger down the text. My heart began to beat with a sudden, frantic rhythm. The clause explicitly outlined the legal parameters for debt collection under our specific state statutes. It detailed the strict timeline for the holding company to legally enforce the terms of the mortgage lien. I read the words 3 times to make sure my eyes were not deceiving me. According to the state property and contract laws governing this specific type of private corporate loan, there was a rigid statute of limitations for the collection of the debt. Because Richard had deliberately structured the loan through his business rather than as a personal family agreement, the debt was subject to strict commercial collection laws. If the holding company did not actively collect a payment, or legally renew the terms of the loan within a 10-year window, the debt became legally uncollectible. I looked up at my mother, my mind racing as the puzzle pieces slammed into place. "Mom, you have not made a single payment to Richard in 15 years, have you?" I asked, my voice trembling with a sudden surge of adrenaline. "No," she replied, a small, defiant smile touching the corners of her mouth. "He told me to never worry about making payments. He said he would just hold the lien in the background. He wanted to keep the debt hanging over us indefinitely so he could always play the generous savior. He wanted absolute control." I looked back down at the yellowed paper. My uncle had outsmarted himself. In his arrogant desire to manipulate our family and maintain absolute dominance, he had completely ignored the basic maintenance of his own corporate contracts. He assumed that because we were family, we would simply cower in fear at his threats. He never bothered to check the legal viability of the weapon he was wielding. By failing to collect a single payment or officially renew the contract for over a decade, the statute of limitations had completely expired 5 years ago. The lien on my mother's house was entirely legally dead. Richard had absolutely no legal authority to foreclose on the property or evict her. I felt a massive, breathtaking wave of relief and triumph wash over me. The suffocating weight that had been pressing down on my chest for the last hour completely vanished. "He cannot touch you," I whispered, staring at the document in awe. "He has no legal standing. The debt is void." My mother reached across the table and placed her warm hand over mine. "Your uncle is a bully, Chloe," she said, her voice ringing with undeniable strength. "Bullies rely on fear and ignorance to control people. He thought he could use me to force you into breaking the law. He thought you would be too terrified to verify his claims." I gripped the promissory note tightly. The reality of the situation rapidly shifted from defensive relief to aggressive realization. Richard had just used a legally dead contract to try and force me into participating in a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme against the federal government. He had explicitly threatened to destroy my mother's life if I did not facilitate a felony. In the eyes of the law, that was not a simple family dispute. Threatening severe financial ruin using invalid legal documents to coerce someone into a criminal act was a completely separate and highly serious offense. My uncle had just crossed the line from corporate arrogance straight into criminal extortion. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket, holding the device like a loaded weapon. My mother watched me, her eyes filled with quiet pride. I was no longer the frightened girl crying in her kitchen. I was a professional compliance director, holding undeniable proof of a massive criminal conspiracy. Richard wanted to play a ruthless game, but he had just handed me the very evidence I needed to completely destroy his empire. I unlocked my screen and opened my contact list. I was not going to call my uncle. I was not going to negotiate with a man who would gladly throw my mother onto the street. I tapped the phone number for the elite federal attorney in Alexandria. It was time to introduce my uncle to the devastating reality of the law. The drive from my mother's quiet suburban neighborhood to Old Town Alexandria felt like crossing a massive invisible boundary between my past and my future. I had the expired promissory note resting securely on the passenger seat right next to my phone, which contained the photograph of Bradley actively forging my digital signature. I was no longer operating out of fear or misplaced family loyalty. The moment Richard threatened my mother with a legally dead contract, he fundamentally changed the rules of engagement. He had crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. I parked my car along the cobblestone street and walked toward a historic brick building that housed one of the most ruthless government contract law firms in the state of Virginia. I did not have an appointment, but I knew the senior partner by reputation. His name was Robert Hughes. He was a former federal prosecutor who had built an entire private practice dismantling corrupt defense contractors and protecting corporate whistleblowers. When I walked into the reception area, I did not ask politely for a moment of his time. I told the receptionist that I was a current compliance director for a Department of Defense contractor, and I had physical evidence of an active multi-million-dollar federal fraud scheme involving national security credentials. Less than 5 minutes later, I was sitting in a heavy leather chair in a sprawling corner office smelling of polished mahogany and strong black coffee. Robert Hughes was a man in his late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a demeanor that completely stripped away any room for nonsense. He sat across his desk from me perfectly still as I laid out the entire situation. I handed him the physical copy of the 15-year-old promissory note. I showed him the time-stamped photograph of Bradley manipulating my cybersecurity maturity model certification inside Adobe Acrobat. I explained the exact timeline of the $8.2 million bid submission and the terrifying phone call where my uncle threatened to throw my mother onto the street if I did not log into the government portal and finalize his crime. Robert reviewed the documents in absolute silence. He traced his finger over the yellowed edges of the promissory note and then zoomed in on the glowing computer screen captured in Sarah's photograph. When he finally looked up at me, his expression was a mixture of profound professional disgust and predatory calculation. "Your uncle is operating with a level of arrogance that borders on complete delusion," Robert said, his voice low and steady. "First, let us address this alleged debt. This promissory note is entirely unenforceable. Under Virginia state law, the statute of limitations on a written contract of this nature has long since expired. By explicitly threatening to seize your mother's home using a voided commercial contract to force you into committing a federal felony, he has committed textbook extortion. That alone is enough to initiate severe criminal proceedings. I let out a long breath, feeling the remaining tension in my shoulders begin to evaporate. Hearing a legal expert validate my mother's intuition was incredibly grounding. But Robert was not finished. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. However, the extortion is actually the least of his problems. Robert continued tapping a pen against the photograph on his phone. This image right here represents a catastrophic violation of federal law. The Department of Defense does not take cybersecurity lightly. By attempting to splice your individual security credentials onto a corporate submission packet, they are actively engaging in wire fraud, identity theft, and making false statements to the federal government. This is not a matter for a simple civil lawsuit, Chloe. This is a matter for the federal authorities. What exactly are you suggesting? I asked, gripping the armrests of my chair. I am suggesting that we stop playing defense. Robert said, a sharp glint appearing in his eyes. We are going to bring down the full weight of the United States government on Miller Logistics. I have a direct contact at the Department of Defense Office of the Inspector General. They handle severe compliance fraud and national security breaches. With your permission, I am going to make a phone call right now, and we are going to hand this entire conspiracy over to the federal investigators. I did not hesitate for a single second. I thought about the years of verbal abuse I had endured. I thought about the way Richard had insulted my late father. I thought about the cold, malicious tone in his voice when he threatened my mother. Do it, I said firmly. Call them. Robert picked up his desk phone and dialed a private number. The conversation was brief, highly technical, and incredibly urgent. Robert spoke in clipped professional sentences detailing the imminent bid submission and the stolen CMMC Level 3 credentials. When he hung up the phone, he looked at me and nodded. We are heading to Arlington, Robert announced, grabbing his suit jacket from the back of his chair. The Inspector General's office wants to see us immediately. The drive to the federal building in Arlington was a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil of my morning. I sat in the passenger seat of Robert's sleek sedan, watching the iconic monuments of Washington, D.C. pass by the window. I was about to walk into a secure government facility to officially blow the whistle on my own family. A tiny part of my brain, the part that had been conditioned by years of toxic family loyalty, felt a brief flicker of guilt. But I quickly extinguished it. Richard and Bradley had made their choice. They chose greed over integrity, and they chose fraud over family. I was simply making sure they faced the consequences of their own actions. We pulled into a highly secure underground parking garage beneath a massive, sterile-looking office building. After passing through metal detectors and rigorous identity checks, we were escorted to a windowless conference room on the 5th floor. The room was cold, illuminated by harsh fluorescent lights, and furnished with a simple metal table and stiff chairs. A few minutes later, the door opened and a tall, broad-shouldered man walked in carrying a thick notepad. He wore a simple gray suit and possessed an aura of quiet, absolute authority. Ms. Miller, the man said, extending his hand. I am Special Agent Hayes with the Department of Defense Office of the Inspector General. Mr. Hughes gave me a brief overview of your situation over the phone. I understand you have evidence of an imminent contract fraud scheme. I shook his hand, appreciating his direct approach. Yes, Agent Hayes, I replied. My former employer, Miller Logistics, is currently altering federal compliance documents to secure an $8.2 million supply chain contract. Agent Hayes sat down at the table and opened his notepad. The atmosphere in the room shifted into immediate professional focus. Please walk me through the exact technical mechanism of the fraud, he instructed. We take any compromise of the CMMC protocols very seriously. If a contractor is handling controlled, unclassified information with fabricated security credentials, it presents a massive risk to national defense infrastructure. I spent the next hour detailing every single aspect of my uncle's business operations. I explained how I had personally earned and maintained the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Level 3 credential entirely under my own name. I provided the exact dates of my employment, the official timestamp of my resignation, and the subsequent panicked voicemails I had received from Richard and Bradley. I laid the phone on the metal table displaying the photograph Sarah had taken. Agent Hayes leaned over, examining the image with intense scrutiny. He noted the Adobe Acrobat software open on the screen. He noted the high-resolution scan of my signature and the clear attempt to modify the dates on the compliance forms. His jaw tightened as he processed the sheer brazenness of the forgery. They are essentially trying to create a ghost employee. Agent Hayes summarized his voice completely flat. They want the automated portal to verify the certification attached to your name while assuming you are still operating as their presiding compliance officer. Exactly, I said. And because I refused to log into the portal and authenticate the transfer, they are forcing the paperwork through manually by forging my wet signature on the final advisory contract. They plan to submit the entire fraudulent package this Friday, before the 5:00 deadline. Agent Hayes sat back in his chair, tapping his pen against his notepad. He looked at Robert, and then he looked directly at me. Ms. Miller, you must understand that by bringing this to our attention, you are initiating a highly aggressive federal investigation. If we proceed, we will be monitoring their digital footprint, tracking their portal submissions, and eventually executing search warrants at their corporate headquarters. This will likely result in severe criminal indictments for the executive officers involved. Are you fully prepared to follow through with this process? I thought about the 70-hour work weeks. I thought about the relentless humiliation. I thought about the way Bradley tossed his golf ball around while I secured their livelihood. Most importantly, I thought about the 15-year-old promissory note resting in Robert's briefcase, the ultimate symbol of my uncle's absolute cruelty. I am fully prepared, Agent Hayes, I said, my voice completely unwavering. I have given that company everything, and they responded by attempting to destroy my life and steal my identity. I want them to be held accountable for every single thing they have done. Agent Hayes offered a small, grim nod of approval. Good. Then we are going to execute a precise counter-strategy. I leaned forward, entirely focused on his words. What do you need me to do? I asked, ready to take whatever defensive measures were necessary to protect myself. I need you to do absolutely nothing, Agent Hayes replied, folding his hands on the table. I blinked in confusion. Nothing, I asked, but they are going to submit the bid on Friday. They are going to use my name. Do you not want to shut down their access to the portal? Do you not want to block the upload? If we block their access right now, we only prove that they intended to commit a crime. Agent Hayes explained, his tone taking on a sharp, tactical edge. Intent is notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially with high-priced corporate lawyers. Your uncle will simply claim his son made a clerical error, or that they uploaded the wrong draft of the document. We do not want to give them any room to maneuver. We want undeniable concrete proof of execution. Robert smiled, leaning back in his chair. He wants them to cross the finish line, Chloe. He wants them to pull the trigger. Exactly, Agent Hayes confirmed. We need the crime to be officially committed on the federal record. The moment they click submit on that government portal, they are transmitting forged documents across federal servers. That instantly triggers mandatory wire fraud charges, identity theft charges, and violations of the False Claims Act. If we stop them now, they might get away with a slap on the wrist. If we let them submit the package, they are handing us a perfectly wrapped federal indictment. The brilliance of the strategy washed over me. It was terrifying, but it was absolutely flawless. We were going to let Richard and Bradley walk blindly into their own execution. So what happens on Friday? I asked, feeling a sudden surge of adrenaline. On Friday, you will ignore their phone calls, Agent Hayes instructed. You will not answer any texts. You will not give them any indication that you have spoken to the authorities. You will let them believe they have completely outsmarted you. My cyber division will be monitoring the procurement portal in real time. We will let their submission go through the initial upload phase. We will capture the IP address, the exact timestamp, and the forged digital signatures. Once the data is secured on our servers, we will manually flag the application for critical compliance failure. And then what happens, I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. And then Agent Hayes said, a cool, relentless determination in his eyes, we let them think they are showing up for a routine compliance review. We let them walk right into the lion's den. The meeting concluded with a flurry of official paperwork. I signed sworn affidavits detailing my resignation and formally denying any advisory role with Miller Logistics. I provided the federal agents with the exact serial numbers of my certification credentials, ensuring the cyber team could track the forged documents the second they hit the government servers. Robert handed over a copy of the expired promissory note officially documenting the extortion attempt to add further weight to the criminal profile being built against my uncle. When Robert and I finally walked out of the federal building, the late afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the pavement. The heavy, suffocating fear that had consumed my entire morning was completely gone. I was no longer a victim waiting for the axe to fall. I was an active participant in a highly coordinated federal sting operation. As we reached his car, Robert turned to me with a reassuring smile. "You did incredibly well in there, Chloe. It takes a massive amount of courage to stand up to family, especially a man as aggressive as your uncle. You saved yourself from a legal nightmare today." "Thank you for believing me, Robert," I said, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. I thought I was going to have to fight this entire battle alone. "You are never alone when you have the truth on your side," he replied, unlocking the car doors. "Now we just have to play the waiting game. Your uncle thinks he is a master chess player, but he has absolutely no idea he is playing against the federal government." The drive back to Alexandria was quiet, but the silence was no longer anxious. It was the calm, steady anticipation of an impending storm. When I finally returned to my apartment, I walked out onto my balcony and looked out at the neighborhood. My phone had remained completely silent for the last 4 hours. Richard and Bradley must have assumed that their brutal blackmail tactic had worked. They must have believed that I was sitting alone, terrified and defeated, too paralyzed by fear to stop their criminal submission. They were completely wrong. I was not hiding. I was waiting. I was going to let them spend the next 48 hours congratulating themselves on their ruthless corporate victory. I was going to let them iron their expensive suits and polish their fancy shoes. I was going to let them walk right into the government facility on Friday afternoon feeling like absolute kings of the world. I took a deep breath of the evening air, a quiet smile spreading across my face. Agent Hayes was absolutely right. The best way to catch a predator is to let them build their own cage. I turned my phone on silent, poured myself a fresh cup of tea and settled in to wait. The perfect legal trap had been set. Thursday morning arrived with a bright, promising sunlight that spilled across my small dining room table. I had transformed this modest space into the temporary command center for my brand new independent compliance consulting firm. I sat with my laptop open, a fresh cup of dark roast coffee steaming beside my legal pad. For the past 7 years, I had operated in a state of perpetual anxiety, constantly managing the bureaucratic chaos created by my Uncle Richard and my cousin Bradley. But today, I was 29 years old, and for the very first time in my professional life, I was building a future that belonged entirely to me. I was drafting articles of incorporation, setting up secure encrypted communication servers, and meticulously organizing a list of defense contractors I had personally guided through the complex maze of Pentagon regulations. Leaving Miller Logistics was supposed to be the end of a very long nightmare. I felt a deep sense of grounded optimism. I knew the value of hard work. I knew the logistics industry inside and out, and I knew that my clients respected my absolute dedication to their success. I had planned 3 preliminary outreach meetings for the day. These were not cold calls to strangers. These were individuals I had worked alongside for years. People whose children's names I knew. People whose businesses I had protected from catastrophic audit failures. I was ready to offer them my independent services free from the toxic shadow of my uncle's empire. The quiet peace of my morning shattered right around 10 o'clock. The first cancellation arrived via a shockingly brief email. It was from a mid-tier defense manufacturer based in Maryland. I had spent countless late nights helping their executive team restructure their entire supply chain compliance model. The email was sterile, devoid of any warmth or familiar greeting. It simply stated that they were pursuing other compliance avenues and wished to cancel our scheduled lunch. There were no best wishes. There was no request to reschedule. It felt like a heavy door being slammed directly in my face. 30 minutes later, my cell phone rang. It was the executive assistant for a major maritime shipping contractor in Norfolk. She sounded incredibly uncomfortable, her voice tight and nervous as she rushed through a highly scripted apology. She informed me that they needed to cancel our afternoon video conference. When I gently asked her if everything was all right, she stammered, heavily muttered something vague about internal corporate restructuring, and quickly hung up the phone. A cold, heavy knot began to form in the pit of my stomach. 2 highly unusual cancellations from long-standing professional contacts in a single morning was not a coincidence. By noon, a third client, a man I had worked with closely for half a decade, flatly declined my calendar invitation without a single word of explanation. The pattern was too deliberate, too coordinated. Someone was actively poisoning the well. I leaned back in my chair, staring blankly at the glowing screen of my laptop. Who would know exactly who I was calling? Who would have the motive to sabotage my brand new business before it even got off the ground? The answer hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow. Bradley. My deeply insecure, intensely jealous cousin had always harbored a bitter resentment toward me. He lacked the basic work ethic to build genuine professional relationships, so he viewed my hard-earned success and the respect I commanded from our clients as a direct personal insult. I reached out to Sarah, my former analyst, who was still bravely navigating the toxic environment inside Miller Logistics. We communicated through a secure, encrypted messaging application. I asked her what Bradley was doing today. Sarah replied almost immediately. She told me Bradley had been locked inside his office all morning with the blinds drawn, making frantic, aggressive phone calls. More importantly, she revealed a terrifying piece of information she had overheard earlier in the week. Bradley had hired a private investigator the very moment I walked out of the building on Monday. He had someone physically follow me. He tracked my independent business registration filings with the State Commerce Commission. He used his executive privileges to pull my personal phone records and contact lists from the company server before my access was completely wiped. Bradley possessed a master list of every single client I was attempting to bring into my new firm. And he was systematically calling every single one of them. I pressed Sarah for more details. I needed to know exactly what he was saying to these people. Her response made the blood in my veins run completely cold. Bradley was not just telling my trusted professional contacts that I had resigned. He was telling them that I was unceremoniously fired for gross corporate misconduct. He was spreading a malicious, highly fabricated story, claiming I was caught stealing highly classified proprietary data and engaging in corporate espionage. He was explicitly warning these contractors that associating with my new firm would instantly trigger severe federal audits and permanently blacklist their companies from future Department of Defense contracts. Defamation. Slander. Pure corporate sabotage. They were not just trying to steal my security credentials for their immediate $8.2 million bid submission. They were actively executing a scorched earth campaign. They wanted to salt the ground so nothing I planted could ever grow. Richard and Bradley wanted to destroy my professional reputation so completely that I would never be able to work in the logistics industry again. They wanted me destitute, humiliated, and crawling back to them, begging for mercy. The sheer vile nature of their game made the room spin. I am a compliance auditor. My entire career, my entire professional identity is built on the absolute foundation of integrity, trust, and playing strictly by the rules. If the tight-knit community of defense contractors believed I was a data thief, my professional life was entirely over. I sat there gripping the edge of my dining table, trying desperately to control the massive wave of panic threatening to overwhelm my logic. I felt incredibly small and profoundly violated. Then my cell phone rang again. I stared at the screen, dreading another cold cancellation. But the caller ID displayed a name that made me pause. General Thomas Vance. General Vance was a retired Army veteran who now ran a highly specialized tactical supply firm. He was a man carved from solid granite, operating with an old-school sense of uncompromising honor. He possessed a zero-tolerance policy for corporate deceit and absolute disdain for entitled executives. 3 years ago, when his firm was facing a disastrous compliance failure due to a massive software integration glitch, I drove to his headquarters and worked 72 hours straight, sleeping on his office floor, to rebuild his entire security protocol from the ground up. I saved his company from federal bankruptcy. I answered the phone, my voice tight with anxiety. General Vance, I said, expecting him to deliver the same cold rejection I had experienced all morning. Chloe the General said, his deep, gravelly voice booming through the speaker. He skipped any polite introductions. I just received a highly disturbing phone call from your cousin, Bradley Miller. I closed my eyes, bracing myself for the absolute worst. I am so sorry, General, I started to say, feeling the tears of frustration burning the corners of my eyes. Do not apologize to me, he commanded, his tone sharp and unwavering. I sat here and listened to that arrogant boy spin a ridiculous tale about you stealing data and committing corporate treason. He spent 20 minutes trying to convince me that you are a criminal liability to my operations. I let him talk until he ran out of breath. And do you know what I told him? I swallowed hard, completely unable to speak. I told him that I have served with actual heroes, and I have dealt with absolute cowards. The general said, his voice radiating a fierce, protective authority. I told him that I know a liar when I hear one. I know your character, Chloe. You are the woman who sacrificed your own health to ensure my men overseas got their tactical supply shipments cleared on time. That boy has never worked a hard day in his privileged little life. I told him that if he ever contacts my firm again with such malicious, baseless slander, I will personally drive down to Alexandria and teach him a very painful lesson in respect. A single tear slipped down my cheek. The immense relief of being believed by someone of his stature, of having my integrity validated by a man who truly understood honor, was completely overwhelming. The general did not stop there. He told me that he knew exactly how these dirty corporate smear campaigns operated. He recognized that Bradley was trying to starve me out of the industry using fear and intimidation. You listen to me, Chloe? The general continued, his tone softening just a fraction. You do not let these corporate bullies intimidate you. I am officially volunteering to be your very first independent client. I am transferring my entire compliance portfolio to your new firm effective immediately. We will handle the paperwork next week. Furthermore, I am offering my services as a direct character witness. I have already drafted a memo detailing Bradley's exact slanderous statements. I will sign a sworn affidavit for your lawyers. You take that boy to court and you make him pay for every lie he told today. I thanked the general with a voice full of profound gratitude. I told him I would never forget his loyalty. When I finally hung up the phone, the oppressive atmosphere in my apartment had completely vanished. The fear that had paralyzed me all afternoon was replaced by an icy, relentless determination. My uncle and my cousin truly thought they were hunting a wounded animal. They thought their money and their aggressive tactics made them invincible. But they had absolutely no idea they were walking blindly into a federal minefield. They had just handed me the exact ammunition I needed to file a devastating civil defamation lawsuit on top of the criminal charges being prepared by the Inspector General. I spent the rest of the afternoon meticulously compiling this new evidence. I forwarded the information regarding Bradley's slanderous phone calls to Robert Hughes, my attorney, in Alexandria. I documented the lost business, the canceled meetings, and the exact timeline of the private investigator's surveillance. The trap that Special Agent Hayes had set was perfectly aligned. All I had to do was remain absolutely silent and wait for the enemy to make their fatal mistake. As the late afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across my living room, my laptop chimed with a highly specific notification sound. My pulse spiked. I had set up an automated tracking alert linked directly to the Department of Defense procurement portal, because my personal credential numbers were embedded in the federal system. I could receive real-time status updates on any corporate activity attempting to utilize my specific clearance tier. I walked over to the table and stared at the glowing screen. The notification window was small, sterile, and completely devoid of emotion. But the text contained within that small digital box carried the massive explosive weight of a federal indictment. It read, Miller Logistics. Contract bid, $8.2 million. Status submitted successfully. I placed my hands on the table, leaning heavily over the keyboard. I read the words 3 times to make absolutely certain my eyes were not deceiving me. It was Thursday afternoon. The official government deadline was not until 5 o'clock on Friday. In their supreme arrogance and sheer reckless desperation, Richard and Bradley did not even wait for the final hour. They pulled the trigger early. They actually did it. They officially transmitted the forged documents across secure federal servers to the United States government. They used my stolen digital signature. They submitted the fabricated advisory contract claiming I was legally bound to their security infrastructure. The crime was no longer an attempt. It was no longer a theoretical conspiracy discussed in a mahogany office. It was a permanent, undeniable federal record. The digital footprint was locked into the Pentagon's servers, complete with timestamps, IP addresses, and fraudulent metadata. The point of no return had been officially crossed. They had sealed their own fate and handed the Inspector General exactly what was needed to tear their empire straight down to the foundation. The brilliant morning sun broke over the nation's capital, casting a fierce, unyielding light across the city. The sky above Washington, D.C. was a crisp, flawless blue, completely devoid of clouds. For so many years, I had driven into this city feeling like an insignificant worker bee, trapped in a relentless cycle of corporate anxiety and familial obligation. I used to grip the steering wheel with sweaty palms, terrified of making a single mistake that might incur my uncle's wrath. Today, however, the drive across the Potomac River felt entirely different. Today, I was not arriving as the overworked and underappreciated niece of Richard Miller. I was arriving as a highly protected federal asset, an independent cybersecurity consultant officially cooperating with the United States Department of Defense. I wore a sharp-tailored charcoal suit that made me feel like I was wrapped in invisible armor. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, severe knot. Looking at my reflection in the rearview mirror, I saw a woman who had finally reclaimed her own power. I pulled into the secure underground parking garage of the Federal Procurement Building just outside the Pentagon. The facility was a massive, intimidating fortress of concrete and reinforced glass, designed to project the absolute authority of the federal government. Special Agent Hayes had arranged for me to have a temporary high-level clearance badge. I walked through the sliding double doors and bypassed the regular civilian security checkpoints completely. 2 armed military police officers escorted me directly to the restricted executive elevators. The heavy steel doors slid shut, blocking out the chaotic noise of the morning commute. As the elevator rapidly ascended to the 8th floor, my heart maintained a calm, steady rhythm. I was not nervous. I was experiencing a profound sense of absolute clarity. I was about to watch a pair of arrogant corporate predators step directly into a cage they had built with their own hands. The executive conference room was massive and sterile. It featured a sprawling, polished mahogany table surrounded by thick, ergonomic leather chairs. The walls were completely bare except for a large digital monitor and the official seal of the Department of Defense. When I walked inside, Special Agent Hayes was already there, sorting through a stack of thick legal folders. He was joined by 3 other high-ranking federal officials, including a senior military procurement officer wearing a crisp uniform adorned with rows of colorful service ribbons. They greeted me with firm handshakes and quiet, respectful nods. There was no small talk. These men and women were the ultimate gatekeepers of national security. and they viewed the falsification of federal documents as a direct assault on the integrity of the United States military. Agent Hayes directed me to take a seat at the far side of the table directly next to the presiding review board. I placed my briefcase on the table and folded my hands neatly in my lap. Now we just had to wait for the prey to arrive. At exactly 9:55, the heavy wooden doors of the conference room swung open. Richard and Bradley walked into the room radiating a sickening aura of supreme arrogance. They looked like two men who had just conquered the entire world. Richard was wearing a custom-tailored Italian Navy suit that probably cost more than my first car. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his expensive leather shoes clicked loudly against the polished floor. Bradley trailed right behind him wearing a light gray suit and a smug, entitled grin that made my stomach turn. He had a sleek, expensive leather portfolio tucked under his arm, completely unaware that the documents inside were basically a one-way ticket to a federal penitentiary. They were beaming with absolute self-satisfaction. They genuinely believed that their brutal blackmail tactics had worked. They believed that by threatening my mother, they had successfully terrified me into silent submission. They thought they had secured an $8.2 million contract and completely crushed my spirit in a single brilliant move. Richard confidently approached the center of the room, buttoning his suit jacket with a practiced smooth motion. He projected the image of a seasoned industry titan completely comfortable in the halls of federal power. He extended his hand toward the senior military procurement officer, offering a wide, charismatic smile that I knew was entirely fake. "Good morning, gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice booming with false warmth. "It is an absolute pleasure to be here today. Miller Logistics is incredibly proud to partner with the Department of Defense. We have brought our final preliminary bid package for the supply chain integration contract. I assure you that our compliance and security protocols are second to none in the entire logistics industry." Bradley stood slightly behind his father, nodding eagerly and trying to look like a serious executive. He puffed out his chest and adjusted his expensive silk tie. He looked absolutely ridiculous trying to play the part of a seasoned vice president. They were so utterly focused on charming the military officers and securing their massive paycheck that they did not even bother to scan the rest of the room. They had assumed this would be a routine, simple handshake meeting. They assumed they would hand over their forged documents, receive a polite nod of approval, and walk out to celebrate their millions with an expensive steak lunch and a bottle of imported champagne. Agent Hayes did not return Richard's smile. He did not accept the outstretched hand. He simply stared at my uncle with a look of cold, clinical detachment. The silence in the large conference room quickly grew incredibly heavy and profoundly uncomfortable. Richard's confident smile faltered just a fraction of an inch as he slowly lowered his hand. He cleared his throat, clearly confused by the remarkably frosty reception. Usually, these procurement meetings were friendly bureaucratic formalities. He was not used to being looked at like a specimen under a microscope. "Please take a seat, Mr. Miller." Agent Hayes instructed, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. "We have a few highly specific matters to discuss before we can officially accept this submission." Richard and Bradley exchanged a quick, puzzled glance before moving to the opposite side of the long mahogany table. They pulled out their leather chairs and sat down. Bradley unzipped his portfolio and proudly placed the thick stack of contract documents right in the center of the table. He smoothed his hands over the cover page, looking incredibly pleased with himself. It was at that exact moment, as Richard settled into his chair and finally looked across the vast expanse of the table, that his eyes locked directly onto mine. I was sitting completely still with my hands folded, resting comfortably next to the senior military officers. I did not look away. I did not flinch. I stared right back at him with an expression of absolute icy resolve. The transformation on Richard's face was genuinely spectacular to witness. It was as if all the blood in his body had suddenly frozen in his veins. The ruddy, healthy color in his cheeks drained away in an instant, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. His jaw went completely slack, and his eyes widened in sheer, unfiltered shock. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost rise from the grave. For a few agonizing seconds, his brain simply could not process the visual information. He could not comprehend why his terrified, obedient niece was sitting on the government side of the table, surrounded by federal investigators. Bradley, who was busy organizing his pens, finally noticed his father's sudden paralysis. He followed Richard's gaze across the room. When Bradley saw me sitting there, his smug, arrogant grin vanished so quickly it was almost comical. He actually gasped out loud, a pathetic, choked sound that echoed loudly in the quiet room. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. You could physically see the panic begin to set in as the horrifying reality of the situation slowly washed over his entitled brain. He knew exactly what he had done on his computer. He knew exactly whose signature he had forged. Seeing me sitting there alive, well and fully cooperating with the authorities completely shattered his illusion of invincibility. What is she doing here? Richard finally managed to stammer, his voice suddenly hoarse and completely lacking its usual booming authority. He pointed a trembling finger in my direction, looking desperately at Agent Hayes. This is a highly confidential corporate review. She does not work for my company anymore. She has absolutely no security clearance to be in this room. Agent Hayes opened his thick file folder, entirely unfazed by Richard's sudden outburst. Actually, Mr. Miller, Ms. Chloe, is exactly where she is supposed to be, he replied smoothly. Given the highly sensitive nature of the cybersecurity requirements for this specific supply chain contract, the Department of Defense felt it was necessary to bring in an independent consultant to verify the integrity of the submitted credentials. Ms. Chloe possesses a flawless background in federal compliance, and she generously agreed to assist the Inspector General's office with this specific audit. The words Inspector General hit the table like a physical bomb. Richard physically recoiled, sinking back into his heavy leather chair. He was a veteran of the logistics industry. He knew exactly what that office represented. They were not simple accountants. They were elite federal investigators who specialized in uncovering massive corporate fraud and sending wealthy executives to federal prison. The realization that he was not sitting in a simple review meeting, but was actively participating in a coordinated federal sting operation, caused a visible tremor to run through his hands. Bradley looked like he was about to pass out. He began to sweat profusely, his eyes darting wildly toward the closed conference room doors, as if he were contemplating a physical escape. But there were armed military police officers standing right outside in the hallway. There was absolutely nowhere to run. They were completely and hopelessly trapped. Agent Hayes reached across the table and pulled the thick stack of bid documents that Bradley had so proudly presented. The agent flipped past the cover page and bypassed the financial projections. He went straight to the heavily restricted compliance section. He moved with slow, deliberate precision, letting the silence build the unbearable tension in the room. He pulled a single sheet of paper from the stack. It was the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification Form. It was the exact document Bradley had doctored in his office. It featured my full name, my specific federal credential numbers, and at the very bottom, the flawless high-resolution scan of my forged signature. I sat perfectly still, watching my uncle's empire completely unravel in front of my eyes. The arrogant men who had belittled my father, who had called me a glorified paper pusher, and who had viciously threatened to leave my elderly mother homeless, were now sitting completely paralyzed with fear. Their expensive suits and country club memberships meant absolutely nothing in this room. They were completely at the mercy of the woman they had so foolishly underestimated. Agent Hayes placed the forged document flat on the table right between us. He smoothed the paper with his hand and looked directly at Richard. His expression was cold hard and totally unforgiving. The atmosphere in the room was so thick you could barely breathe. Mr. Miller, Agent Hayes said, his voice cutting through the silence like a sharpened knife. This document explicitly lists Ms. Chloe as your active honorary consultant of cybersecurity operations. It clearly states that she is legally attaching her Level 3 clearance to your corporate bid. Furthermore, it features a signature that indicates she fully reviewed and authorized this federal submission. Richard could not speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He looked at the document, and then he looked at me. his eyes pleading, begging for mercy that he absolutely did not deserve. Bradley was literally shaking beside him, his face buried in his hands. Before I answered that question, my mind briefly traveled back through the last 7 years of my life. I remembered the countless evenings I spent eating cold takeout food at my desk, while ensuring their supply chain manifests were perfectly compliant. I remembered the condescending remarks Richard made at family gatherings, always making sure everyone knew that I was just a charity case he had taken pity on. I remembered Bradley showing up to work at 11 in the morning, smelling like expensive cologne and cheap alcohol, taking credit for the complex audit reports I had spent weeks compiling. I had built a massive fortress of patience and forgiveness, always believing that loyalty was a virtue that would eventually be rewarded. But loyalty to toxic people is just a slow form of self-destruction. When Richard decided to use my mother's home as a blackmail token, he did not just break my heart. He completely shattered the illusion of our family bond. He revealed the dark, empty void where his conscience should have been. And Bradley, in his lazy, desperate attempt to steal my identity, had proven that he was nothing more than a cowardly parasite willing to send his own cousin to federal prison just to maintain his unearned wealthy lifestyle. Sitting in that cold, heavily secured Pentagon conference room, I felt a profound sense of peace. The anxiety that used to govern my every waking moment had entirely evaporated. The fear of being fired, the fear of disappointing my uncle, the fear of not being good enough, it was all gone. I was surrounded by men and women in military uniforms and sharp federal suits who looked at me not as a disposable clerk, but as a highly valued expert. General Vance's words echoed in my mind. I was a professional. I was a woman of integrity. And I was finally taking out the trash. I looked at the piece of paper Agent Hayes was holding. The forgery was incredibly well done. Bradley had clearly spent hours meticulously isolating my signature pixel by pixel, ensuring the digital background matched the new federal form perfectly. He had copied my exact title, my certification serial numbers, and even the specific date format I always used for official compliance approvals. To an untrained eye, it looked like a perfectly legitimate, legally binding authorization. But federal investigators do not have untrained eyes, and they do not look kindly upon individuals who attempt to defraud the United States military. The moment I spoke my answer, the trap would violently snap shut. The automated tracking data collected by the portal on Thursday afternoon, combined with my sworn verbal testimony right here in this room, would lock Richard and Bradley into a federal prosecution they could never escape. There would be no settlements. There would be no quiet corporate fines. There would only be handcuffs and long prison sentences. The air conditioning hummed faintly in the background, a low mechanical drone that contrasted with the heavy, pulsing silence of the humans in the room. The polished mahogany table reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting, creating a glaring white streak right down the center, dividing the room into two distinct sides. On one side sat the full authority of the federal government, armed with undeniable proof of a felony. On the other side sat two arrogant men rapidly shrinking into their expensive designer suits, completely paralyzed by the realization of their own impending doom. I allowed the silence to stretch just a little bit longer. I wanted Richard to feel every single agonizing second of his defeat. I wanted him to remember the moment he called my father a family failure. I wanted him to remember the exact tone of his voice when he threatened to throw my mother out of her home. I wanted the memory of this specific moment to burn into his mind so deeply that he would see it every time he closed his eyes in his federal prison cell. Bradley let out a pathetic whimpering sound, covering his face entirely with his shaking hands. The heavy leather portfolio he had brought into the room now sat on the table like a ticking bomb. The elaborate corporate lie they had constructed was entirely exposed, completely stripped of its protective veneer. They had walked directly into the lion's den wearing suits made of raw meat. I looked at the forged signature on the paper. It was a perfect replica of my name, but it lacked the absolute most important element of any legal document. It lacked my consent. It lacked my truth. And today, the truth was the only thing that mattered. Agent Hayes remained perfectly still, holding the document, waiting for my final declaration. The senior military officer leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his eyes narrowing as he observed the sheer panic radiating from my uncle and my cousin. They knew. Everyone in the room knew exactly what the answer was going to be. But the law requires formal verbal confirmation. The law requires the trap to be officially closed. I looked straight at Richard, my face completely blank, a mask of absolute professional detachment. Then I turned my attention back to the federal investigator. I parted my lips, taking a slow, steady breath as the entire room waited for my response. Ms. Chloe, Agent Hayes asked, his voice ringing out with absolute federal authority. For the official record of the Department of Defense, can you please confirm if this signature is yours? The tense silence inside the secure Department of Defense conference room was absolute and suffocating. It was the kind of heavy, paralyzing quiet that precedes a massive physical explosion. Agent Hayes sat perfectly still with the forged compliance document resting on the polished mahogany table directly between us. The senior military procurement officer folded his hands, leaning forward with a completely unreadable expression. The entire room was waiting for my answer. Across the vast expanse of the table, my uncle Richard and my cousin Bradley were practically disintegrating before my eyes. Richard was staring at me with a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. The ruddy, confident color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a fragile old man. The expensive tailored Italian Navy suit he wore suddenly seemed far too large for his shrinking frame. Bradley was in an even worse state. He was actively hyperventilating, his chest heaving up and down as he gripped the armrests of his leather chair so tightly his knuckles were stark white. A bead of sweat rolled slowly down his temple. They both knew exactly what was about to happen. They knew the trap they had blindly walked into was about to snap shut. Agent Hayes repeated his question, his voice cutting through the heavy air with the cold precision of a scalpel. Ms. Chloe, for the official record of the Department of Defense, can you please confirm if this digital signature is yours? I did not answer immediately. I let the silence stretch, allowing the agonizing weight of their impending doom to settle firmly over their shoulders. I looked directly into Richard's eyes. In that brief span of time, my mind replayed the last 7 years of my life. I saw the countless weekends I spent hunched over my laptop, fixing their careless mistakes. I heard the echo of Richard's voice on the patio, calling my late father a family failure. I felt the sickening chill of his phone call, threatening to throw my elderly mother out of her home, just to protect his own selfish greed. I had spent my entire adult life trying to earn the respect of a man who possessed absolutely no moral compass. Today, that cycle of abuse officially ended. I shifted my gaze to the federal document resting on the table. It was a remarkably good forgery, but it represented everything toxic and corrupt about Miller Logistics. I looked back at Agent Hayes and spoke with a voice so steady and clear it practically rang off the walls. That is not my signature, Agent Hayes. I officially resigned my position as Director of Federal Contract Compliance at Miller Logistics on Monday morning. I severed all professional ties with their organization long before this digital file was ever created. I have never seen this document before today, and I absolutely did not authorize the use of my cybersecurity maturity model certification for this bid submission. The words landed with the devastating impact of an artillery strike. Richard violently flinched as if I had reached across the table and struck him across the face. He opened his mouth, his jaw working frantically, but he could not form a coherent sentence. The senior military officer sitting next to me let out a sharp breath of absolute disgust and forcefully pushed his chair back from the table. Agent Hayes nodded slowly, his expression hardening into a mask of pure federal authority. Thank you for your honest verification, Ms. Chloe. Your sworn statement aligns perfectly with the digital evidence my cyber division collected yesterday afternoon. Richard finally found his voice. It was a pathetic, high-pitched scramble of desperate lies. Wait just a minute, he stammered, raising his shaking hands in the air. This is all just a terrible misunderstanding. There has been a massive clerical error. My niece is clearly confused. Or perhaps she is holding a personal grudge over a minor family dispute. We employ an entire department of administrative assistants. Someone must have accidentally uploaded an older draft of the compliance form. We can fix this right now. We can bring in a new consultant by Monday morning. You cannot possibly invalidate our entire $8.2 million bid over a simple administrative oversight. Richard offered a weak, sickly smile, trying desperately to tap into his usual charismatic charm. It failed completely. He looked pathetic. Agent Hayes did not smile back. He did not even blink. He reached into his thick legal folder and pulled out a stack of high-resolution photographs. He laid them out across the mahogany table one by one. The images were clear, irrefutable printouts of the digital forensics his team had captured. This was not a simple clerical oversight. Mr. Miller, Agent Hayes stated, his voice radiating pure, lethal authority. My cyber division has been actively monitoring your corporate IP address since Wednesday morning. We watched in real time as someone inside your executive suite bypassed a restricted employee profile. We watched as they accessed a secured database, isolated a digital rendering of Ms. Chloe's wet signature, and deliberately spliced it onto a newly generated Department of Defense advisory contract. We tracked the exact metadata of the file creation. We tracked the exact timestamp of the upload. Agent Hayes leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. You did not accidentally upload an old draft. You deliberately manufactured a fraudulent federal document to bypass strict national security protocols. You knowingly submitted stolen identification credentials to the United States military. Bradley let out a loud, suffocating gasp. He pushed his chair back, trying to put physical distance between himself and the terrifying photographs on the table. His chest was heaving, and he looked like he was genuinely going to be sick right there on the expensive carpet. Before Richard could attempt to formulate another desperate lie, the heavy wooden doors of the conference room swung open with a loud, forceful crack. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from a tense corporate meeting to an active criminal crime scene. 6 federal agents walked into the room. They were dressed in dark, tactical windbreakers, with the bright yellow letters of the Inspector General's office printed boldly across their backs. They moved with swift, coordinated military precision, fanning out across the room and physically blocking the only exit. 2 of the agents stepped directly behind Richard and Bradley, standing with their hands resting casually on their utility belts. The sheer physical presence of federal law enforcement officers in the room completely shattered whatever remaining delusions my uncle was desperately clinging to. Agent Hayes stood up from his chair, towering over the table. Richard Miller and Bradley Miller, you are currently the subjects of an active federal criminal investigation. He announced, his voice echoing with absolute finality. Based on the digital evidence collected by my office and the sworn testimony provided today, we have established clear probable cause that you have engaged in a coordinated conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Agent Hayes began listing the charges, and each word felt like a heavy nail being driven into their coffins. We are actively pursuing indictments for wire fraud, felony identity theft, and multiple severe violations of the False Claims Act. Falsifying national security documents to deceive the Department of Defense is a catastrophic offense. A federal judge has already signed the search warrants for your corporate headquarters in Virginia. As we speak, a secondary tactical team is currently securing your executive offices, seizing your servers, and impounding every single computer on the premises. Richard's face transitioned from a sickly gray to a vibrant, terrifying shade of purple. The realization that his entire empire was being physically dismantled by federal agents completely broke him. The facade of the wealthy, sophisticated corporate titan entirely crumbled, revealing the cowardly, ruthless, selfish man hiding underneath. He looked around the room, his eyes darting frantically from the armed agents to the severe military officers, and finally landing on his own son. In that precise moment, Richard's ultimate survival instinct kicked in. He did exactly what he had always done whenever he was backed into a corner. He looked for a scapegoat. He looked for someone else to carry the burden of his own failures. And because I had successfully removed myself from his line of fire, He turned his vicious predatory sights directly onto the only other target available. It was him, Richard suddenly shouted, pointing an accusatory shaking finger directly at Bradley. I had absolutely nothing to do with this. I am the chief executive officer. I do not handle the low-level technical submissions. Bradley is the vice president of federal affairs. He is the one who handles the procurement portal. He is the one who generated the forms. If a document was forged, it was because this incompetent idiot panicked and tried to cover up his own massive mistakes. I never authorized anyone to steal my niece's signature. The entire room went completely still. Even the federal agents standing behind them seemed momentarily taken aback by the sheer breathtaking speed of the betrayal. Richard was actively throwing his own flesh and blood directly under the federal bus, hoping the wheels would crush his son instead of him. Bradley stared at his father with an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. His mouth hung open and his eyes were wide with total disbelief. He had spent his entire life desperately seeking his father's approval. He had bullied me, belittled me, and eagerly participated in this massive criminal fraud just to impress the man sitting next to him. And in the span of a single heartbeat, his father had discarded him like a piece of trash. "You are lying!" Bradley screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of profound panic and deep visceral betrayal. He jumped up from his chair, knocking it backward onto the floor. "You ordered me to do it. You stood right over my shoulder in the office and watched me edit the file. You told me that if we lost the $8 million contract, our investors would pull out and the company would go bankrupt. You told me to use her signature. You said she was just a stupid girl, and she would be too terrified to ever say a word." "Shut your mouth, you pathetic little failure!" Richard roared, slamming his fist violently onto the mahogany table. "I gave you the vice president title because you begged for it. I gave you one simple job, and you managed to commit a federal felony. You ruined my company. You ruined my reputation. I should have fired you years ago and left you on the street. You are the failure!" Bradley shouted back, completely losing whatever shred of sanity he had left. He pointed aggressively at his father, tears of absolute rage streaming down his flushed face. "You could not even maintain the security licenses yourself. You relied on Chloe to do everything while you drank scotch and played golf. You forced me to commit fraud because you are too cheap to hire real compliance officers. Tell them the truth. Tell the agents that you threatened to foreclose on Aunt Mary's house if Chloe did not cover up your crime." "You ungrateful little bastard!" Richard bellowed, physically lunging across his chair toward his son. "I gave you everything you have. I bought your cars. I paid for your apartment. Without my money, you are absolutely nothing. You are going to take the fall for this because it was your computer and your login credentials. I will hire the best defense attorneys in Washington, and I will make sure you take the entire blame." The two men stood in the middle of the secure Department of Defense conference room, viciously screaming at each other. They traded vile insults and shouted bitter curses, completely ignoring the presence of the military officers and the armed federal agents surrounding them. It was a spectacular, humiliating display of pure, toxic implosion. All the false loyalty, the fake corporate prestige, and the generational arrogance they had paraded around for years had been instantly burned away by the terrifying threat of a federal prison sentence. They were tearing each other apart right in front of my eyes. I sat perfectly still, watching the chaotic scene unfold. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel any lingering familial guilt. I only felt a deep, clean sense of justice. For 7 years, they had made me feel small, insignificant, and terrified. They had convinced me that without their charity, I would never survive in the professional world. Now the truth was laid entirely bare. Without my hard work and my integrity, they were nothing but a pair of cowardly criminals turning on each other the very second the lights were turned on. Agent Hayes let the screaming match continue for a few more seconds, allowing the two men to publicly verify their mutual guilt on the federal record. Then he raised his hand, signaling the tactical agents. "That is quite enough." Agent Hayes commanded, his voice easily cutting through the chaotic shouting. The two agents standing behind Richard and Bradley immediately stepped forward, placing their heavy hands firmly on the men's shoulders and forcing them back into their seats. Richard collapsed into his chair, breathing heavily, his chest heaving with exertion and fury. Bradley sank down, covering his face and sobbing loudly, his complete breakdown echoing pathetically in the quiet room. The senior military procurement officer, who had remained silently observant throughout the entire ordeal, finally stood up. He adjusted his uniform jacket and looked down at Richard and Bradley with an expression of absolute disgust. He looked at them not as businessmen, but as an infectious disease that had attempted to infiltrate his secure facility. Mr. Miller, the general, began, his voice echoing with the rigid, uncompromising authority of the United States military. The Department of Defense relies on the absolute integrity of our supply chain contractors to maintain the safety and security of our armed forces. Attempting to deliberately deceive this review board by utilizing stolen and falsified cybersecurity credentials is an unforgivable breach of that fundamental trust. You have not only wasted the time of this federal office, but you have demonstrated a complete lack of basic moral character. The general picked up the forged compliance document from the table, holding it by the corner as if it were contaminated. Effective immediately, the Miller Logistics bid for the $8.2 million tactical supply contract is officially canceled and permanently rejected. The general announced, dropping the paper back onto the table. Furthermore, I am initiating an immediate comprehensive review of every single active military contract currently held by your organization. Richard closed his eyes, a long, shuddering breath escaping his lips as the financial reality of the $8 million loss finally struck him. But his nightmare was far from over. Agent Hayes stepped forward, holding one final document in his hand. He placed it firmly on the table directly in front of my uncle. The rejection of the current bid is merely the beginning, Mr. Miller. Agent Hayes stated, his voice ringing with cold finality. Because you have utilized federal portals to transmit fraudulent national security documents, the Inspector General's office is taking immediate protective action. Richard looked down at the document, his eyes scanning the bold black lettering at the top of the page. He began to shake his hands, trembling so violently he could not even pick up the paper. You are hereby served with an official notice of permanent corporate debarment, Agent Hayes declared. Effective immediately. Miller Logistics and all affiliated executive officers are permanently banned from bidding on, participating in, or receiving any federal contracts from the United States government. You are completely shut out of the federal sector. Your company is effectively dead. The speed at which a multi-million-dollar empire collapses is a truly spectacular thing to witness. It does not happen in slow motion. It happens with the sudden, catastrophic violence of a controlled building demolition. By the time the weekend arrived, the news of the federal debarment had spread through the Washington contracting community like a devastating wildfire. Miller Logistics was no longer a respected name in the industry. It was a completely radioactive entity. The permanent debarment issued by the Department of Defense was an absolute death sentence for a company that relied entirely on government supply chain contracts. Every single active military contract my uncle held was instantly terminated for cause. The federal government does not do business with individuals who forge national security credentials, and they absolutely do not pay outstanding invoices to companies under active criminal investigation for fraud. The financial strangulation was immediate and entirely merciless. In the corporate world, loyalty only extends as far as the bottom line. The moment the news networks reported that federal agents had raided the Miller Logistics headquarters and seized their servers, the financial institutions panicked. The banks that had eagerly funded Richard's lavish lifestyle and provided his massive commercial credit lines immediately froze all of his operating accounts. They triggered default clauses and demanded immediate repayment of millions of dollars in corporate debt. Richard had spent years building a house of cards financed by arrogance and borrowed money. Now a massive hurricane had arrived and the cards were scattering into the wind. My cousin Bradley fared absolutely no better. In a desperate, cowardly attempt to save his own skin, he had spent his entire interrogation throwing his father under the bus. He cried to the federal prosecutors, claiming he was just following orders and that he had been manipulated by his tyrannical father. But the digital forensics told the undeniable truth. The cyber investigators proved that Bradley was the one who personally sat at the computer, manipulated my electronic signature, and uploaded the fraudulent file to the government portal. Ignorance is not a valid legal defense when you are the one pulling the trigger. The State Commerce Commission moved swiftly and mercilessly, permanently revoking Bradley's professional management licenses. He was legally barred from holding any executive position in the logistics and contracting industry for the rest of his life. Without his inflated salary and his father's protective umbrella, his superficial lifestyle vanished overnight. His luxury apartment lease was terminated. His expensive sports car was repossessed in the middle of the night. He was left with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of his own impending federal trial. As for my uncle, the consequences of his overwhelming greed were far more severe than just losing his company. The Department of Justice hit Richard with a massive civil penalty for violating the False Claims Act, effectively bankrupting him on a personal level. The man who had mocked my father for leaving behind a small mortgage was now drowning in tens of millions of dollars of insurmountable legal fines and federal penalties. His country club revoked his membership. His wealthy friends completely stopped returning his phone calls. He became a total pariah in the city he once thought he owned. 3 weeks after the explosive confrontation at the Pentagon, the dust had finally begun to settle. It was a quiet Tuesday morning, and I was sitting at the kitchen island in my mother's house. We were drinking fresh coffee and eating warm blueberry muffins. The atmosphere in the house was incredibly peaceful. My independent consulting firm was already thriving beyond my wildest expectations. General Vance had been true to his word, bringing his entire portfolio to my company and referring several other high-profile defense contractors who valued absolute integrity over flashy corporate presentations. I was finally building a legacy that I could be genuinely proud of. The quiet comfort of our morning was suddenly interrupted by the harsh, frantic ringing of the front doorbell. My mother and I exchanged a cautious glance. I stood up from the wooden stool and walked down the hallway toward the front door. I peered through the glass side panel and my breath caught in my throat. Standing on our front porch was my Uncle Richard. I barely recognized the man standing on the other side of the glass. The imposing, sophisticated corporate titan was completely gone. The man waiting on our porch looked broken-aged and entirely pathetic. He was not wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit. He wore a wrinkled gray jacket that hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His silver hair, which was usually perfectly groomed, was completely disheveled. His face was gaunt, his eyes heavily bloodshot, and surrounded by dark, exhausted shadows. He looked like a man who had not slept or eaten a proper meal in weeks. I unlocked the deadbolt and slowly pulled the door open, but I kept the heavy metal screen door firmly shut between us. I stood tall, my posture rigid, radiating the absolute confidence of a woman who had completely reclaimed her own power. Chloe. Richard croaked his voice, a weak, raspy whisper that sounded like sandpaper. Please. Please let me come inside. I need to speak with you and your mother. I need to explain. There is absolutely nothing left to explain, Richard, I replied, my voice perfectly calm and completely devoid of any sympathy. You are not welcome in this house. You need to leave right now. He grabbed the handle of the screen door, rattling it desperately, but it remained securely locked. Please, Chloe. He begged, tears welling up in his bloodshot eyes and spilling over his wrinkled cheeks. I have lost everything. The banks have seized my house. The federal prosecutors are offering me a plea deal that involves 10 years in a federal penitentiary. 10 years, Chloe. I will die in there. You have to help me. You have to call the Inspector General and tell them you made a mistake. Tell them you gave Bradley verbal permission to use your signature. Tell them it was all just a terrible miscommunication. If you just withdraw your testimony, the entire federal case against me will completely fall apart. I stared at him, feeling a profound wave of absolute disgust. Even now, standing on the porch of the home he had maliciously threatened to steal, he was still trying to manipulate me. He was still trying to force me to commit perjury and risk my own freedom just to save him from the consequences of his own criminal actions. I stepped closer to the screen door, my eyes locked directly onto his. "You are asking me to lie to federal agents and risk going to prison so you can escape justice," I said, my tone dripping with icy contempt. "After everything you have done to me, you still think I am nothing more than a tool for you to use. We are family." "Chloe," Richard sobbed, his voice breaking as he played his ultimate desperate card. "We are blood. Your father was my brother. He would never want to see me destroyed like this. He would never want to see his own brother locked in a cage. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. You have to forgive me. Please, for the sake of our family, just help me." I heard quiet footsteps behind me. My mother stepped into the entryway, standing right by my side. She looked at the pathetic, weeping man on the porch with an expression of quiet, monumental strength. She did not look frightened or intimidated. She looked at him with the pity one reserves for a dangerous animal that has finally been trapped. "Do not ever invoke my husband's name to justify your own wickedness. Richard," my mother said, her voice ringing clear and authoritative. "My husband was a good, honest man who loved his family. You used his tragic death as an opportunity to construct a financial trap. You kept a fake mortgage hanging over my head for 15 years, just waiting for the perfect moment to exploit my daughter. You have absolutely no understanding of what family means. Family protects each other. Family does not commit extortion." Richard fell to his knees on the concrete porch, openly weeping into his hands. "Mary, please," he wailed, looking up at my mother through his tears. "I was desperate. I was losing the business. I never actually intended to take your home. I was just angry and I said things I did not mean. Please show some mercy. I am begging you. I have no money left. I have no lawyers left. My own son will not even look at me. I have absolutely nothing." I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out a neatly folded legal document. It was a heavily restricted protective order that Robert Hughes had successfully filed and secured from a federal judge the previous afternoon. It explicitly barred Richard and Bradley Miller from coming within 500 feet of my person, my residence, or my mother's property. I pushed open the screen door just a fraction of an inch and tossed the folded legal document directly onto the concrete porch. It landed right in front of Richard's trembling knees. "I want you to pick up that piece of paper and read it very carefully, Richard," I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "That is a federal restraining order. If you ever contact me again, if you ever set foot on this property again, or if you ever try to reach out to my mother, the local police will arrest you immediately, and you will sit in a holding cell until your federal trial begins." Richard stared at the white paper on the ground, his entire body shaking with violent, desperate sobs. He looked up at me, his face twisted into a mask of pure, defeated agony. "Chloe, please," he whimpered, reaching a trembling hand out toward me. "What am I supposed to do? My life is completely over." I looked down at the man who had tormented me for 7 agonizing years. I remembered the exact moment on the patio when he raised his glass of expensive whiskey and publicly humiliated me in front of our entire family. I remembered him calling my beloved father a failure. I remembered him looking at me with pure arrogance and telling me that I was just a glorified desk clerk who needed to sit down and know my place. I stood tall, leaning slightly through the doorway. I looked directly into his tear-filled eyes, and I gave him the exact same cold, merciless smile he had given me that Sunday afternoon. "You are going to do exactly what you told me to do, Richard," I said slowly, enunciating every single word so they would brand themselves deeply into his memory. "You are going to sit down, and you are going to know your place. You are nothing but a broken old man crying on a porch, and you will never amount to anything again." I pulled back inside the house and firmly pulled the heavy wooden front door shut. The sharp metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place sounded like a gunshot echoing through the quiet entryway. It was the definitive sound of absolute closure. Through the thick glass window, I watched Richard slowly pick up the restraining order from the ground. He clutched the paper to his chest, struggling to his feet like an incredibly frail old man. He turned his back to our house and slowly stumbled down the concrete walkway, his shoulders slumped and his head hanging heavily in utter defeat. I watched him get into a cheap rented sedan and drive away, disappearing down the street and out of our lives forever. 3 months later, the federal justice system delivered its final devastating blow. Richard Miller pled guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud, criminal extortion, and defrauding the United States government. The judge showed absolutely no leniency to a man who had attempted to compromise national security protocols for his own personal enrichment. Richard was sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary with absolutely no possibility of early parole. The remaining assets of Miller Logistics were completely liquidated by the government to pay off the massive civil fines and restitution orders. Bradley, attempting to secure a lighter sentence by fully cooperating with the prosecution, ended up receiving 4 years in a minimum security facility for his direct role in the forgery and identity theft. The arrogant father and son duo, who had once believed they were entirely above the law, were now reduced to federal inmate numbers, stripped of their wealth, their freedom, and their completely unearned prestige. As for me, the collapse of their fraudulent empire was the absolute ultimate catalyst for my own brilliant rebirth. My independent consulting firm grew exponentially. I hired a team of dedicated, brilliant compliance officers, including Sarah, who happily resigned from the sinking ship of Miller Logistics the very moment the federal raids began. We built a company culture based on absolute transparency, rigorous honesty, and profound mutual respect. I bought my mother a beautiful new greenhouse for her garden, and we spent our weekends enjoying the incredible, peaceful reality of a life free from toxic manipulation. Sometimes when I am sitting in my beautiful, sunlit office overlooking the city, I think back to that terrifying Sunday afternoon barbecue. I think about the paralyzing fear that used to dictate my every decision. I realize now that the darkest moments in our lives, the moments where we feel completely broken and entirely discarded, are often the exact moments that force us to discover our own incredible hidden strength. You can spend your entire life trying to please toxic people, hoping that they will eventually see your worth, or you can simply walk away and build a table of your own. If you are listening to this story and you have ever felt trapped by the heavy, suffocating weight of toxic family loyalty, please remember my journey. You are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep someone else warm. You have the absolute right to protect your peace, to defend your integrity, and to walk away from anyone who attempts to use your love as a weapon against you. Your worth is not determined by the opinions of arrogant, manipulative people. Your worth is determined by your own strength, your own honesty, and your own refusal to surrender your dignity. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my story today. If this journey of reclaiming power and demanding justice resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible true stories. I would absolutely love to hear from you in the comment section below. Let me know what city or country you are watching from and what time it is right now as you listen. Stay strong, stay absolutely true to yourself, and never be afraid to stand up and walk away from the darkness. See you in the next story. 6 months can pass in the blink of an eye, or it can stretch into an entire lifetime, depending entirely on which side of the storm you happen to be standing. When I walk into my office suite, now the very first thing I notice is the brilliant light. My new workspace is located on the 12th floor of a beautiful modern commercial building in downtown Alexandria, and the morning sun pours through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the entire room in a warm, golden glow. There are no dark, heavy mahogany doors here. There are no shadowed corners where toxic executives can hide their fraudulent schemes. Everything in my new firm is bright, transparent, and completely mine. I sat down at my custom glass desk and opened my laptop, taking a long moment to simply appreciate the quiet, steady rhythm of my own company. The frosted lettering on the glass door out in the reception area reads, Miller Compliance and Strategic Advisory. It is a name I built from the ground up using absolutely nothing but my own genuine expertise and an unbreakable commitment to doing things the right way. The spectacular aftermath of the federal investigation into my uncle and my cousin had sent a massive, undeniable shockwave through the entire Washington contracting community. When the Department of Defense officially issued the permanent debarment against Miller Logistics, the industry was forced to pay incredibly close attention to exactly why it happened. The Federal Review Board did not keep my involvement a secret. In fact, the Inspector General publicly highlighted my proactive cooperation as the absolute gold standard for corporate integrity, because I chose to step forward and protect the federal procurement system. The government agencies realized that my cybersecurity credentials were not just expensive pieces of paper. They knew I possessed the absolute moral courage to enforce the law, even when the law required me to stand up against my own flesh and blood. That level of proven trust became the single greatest marketing tool I could have ever asked for. Within a matter of weeks, my phone began to ring non-stop. The very same mid-tier defense contractors who had abruptly canceled their lunch appointments with me back in the spring were suddenly calling my office, practically begging for a consultation. They had quickly realized that Bradley was spreading malicious lies to cover up his own impending federal indictment. I politely but firmly declined their business. I no longer had the time or the desire to work with fair-weather clients who would abandon me at the very first sign of a fabricated corporate rumor. Instead, my roster was entirely filled with high-level military suppliers referred directly by General Thomas Vance. The general had been true to every single word he spoke to me. He brought his massive tactical supply portfolio to my firm, and he personally vouched for my character in closed-door rooms, where multi-million-dollar decisions were routinely made. Because of his unwavering outspoken support and my flawless track record, we won 3 massive federal compliance contracts in the span of just 2 months. My business grew so rapidly that I had to lease additional office space and immediately hire a dedicated team of brilliant analysts. Sarah, the brave young woman who had secretly warned me about Bradley forging my digital signature, was the very first person I called. I offered her a senior analyst position with a salary that reflected her actual worth, and she accepted before I could even finish pitching the benefits package. We were thriving. We were operating a completely honest, highly lucrative consulting firm, and we were doing it without ever having to lie, cheat, or manipulate the system. Every single dollar that entered our corporate bank account was earned through sheer competence and relentless, honest hard work. I finished reviewing a complex final security audit for a new aerospace client, signed my digital authorization at the bottom of the file, and closed my laptop for the weekend. It was a beautiful Friday afternoon, and I had a very important place to be. I grabbed my purse, walked out of my sunlit office, and took the elevator down to the parking garage. The drive from Alexandria out to the quiet Virginia suburbs felt entirely different now. I used to grip the steering wheel with sweaty palms, deeply dreading the inevitable phone calls from my uncle demanding I fix his catastrophic supply chain mistakes. I used to drive with a heavy, suffocating knot of pure anxiety sitting right in the center of my chest. Today, the car windows were rolled down. The radio was playing softly and the air felt incredibly crisp and profoundly free. I pulled into the familiar driveway of my mother's house and put the car in park. The property looked absolutely radiant in the late afternoon light. The charming brick exterior seemed to literally glow, and the front lawn was a lush, vibrant green. But the most beautiful sight was in the side yard. My mother was wearing a wide-brimmed straw hat and a comfortable pair of gardening overalls. She was holding a bright yellow watering can, carefully tending to the massive row of blooming rose bushes my father had planted over 2 decades ago. I walked across the soft grass and called out to her. She turned around and a bright, genuine smile completely illuminated her face. She set the watering can down on the dirt and walked over to give me a warm, comforting hug. She smelled of fresh, damp earth and sweet floral blossoms. There was a remarkable lightness to her movements now, a physical unburdening that brought quick tears of profound gratitude to my eyes. For 15 long years, she had lived under the terrifying shadow of a fake commercial loan. She had tiptoed carefully around her own brother-in-law, genuinely believing that if she ever spoke out of turn, he would snap his fingers and throw her out onto the street. That heavy, invisible chain had dictated our family dynamics for my entire adult life. But the exact moment the federal authorities dragged Richard away in handcuffs, that chain was permanently shattered. The property deed was completely clear. The house belonged entirely to her, free of any debt, free of any sinister corporate liens, and completely free of any lingering malicious threats. We walked up the concrete path to the front porch and sat together on the old wooden swing. I handed her a small white pastry box I had picked up from the local bakery down the street. She opened it, and we shared a quiet, peaceful moment, simply enjoying the beautiful reality of our restored lives. I watched the evening wind gently rustle the leaves of the grand oak tree in the front yard, and my mind naturally drifted toward the profound, complex lessons this entire ordeal had forced me to learn. Society places a massive, overwhelming emphasis on the concept of family loyalty. From the time we are very young children, we are taught that blood is thicker than water. We are socially conditioned to believe that we must unconditionally support our relatives simply because we share a common last name or a biological lineage. We are heavily pressured to forgive terrible behavior, to completely overlook blatant disrespect, and to swallow our own personal pride in the name of keeping the traditional family unit intact. But I learned the hard way that blind, unconditional loyalty is a highly dangerous trap. Toxic people will eagerly take advantage of your moral compass. They will weaponize your sense of duty to force your ultimate submission. Richard and Bradley did not view my fierce loyalty as a virtue. They viewed it as a simple weakness they could relentlessly exploit for their own massive financial gain. They believed that because I was family, they could belittle my late father, steal my professional identity, and jeopardize my personal freedom without ever facing a single consequence. They assumed I would always be the quiet, obedient niece who simply put her head down and followed their arrogant orders. I realized sitting on that peaceful porch swing that you should never devalue your own life to satisfy the selfish demands of a toxic family member. You are not legally or morally obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep someone else warm. True respect is never demanded through emotional threats or aggressive corporate intimidation. True respect is earned through honesty, absolute integrity, and mutual kindness. When you possess genuine competence and real, undeniable talent, you do not need to humble yourself before anyone. You do not need to beg for a seat at the executive table when you are perfectly capable of building your own table from scratch. My uncle genuinely believed that his generational wealth and his aggressive bullying tactics made him an invincible force in the defense industry. He actually thought that I was nothing without his gracious charity. But the absolute truth was that his entire corrupt empire relied entirely on my quiet, uncredited labor. The exact moment I stood up, recognized my own intrinsic value, and simply walked away, his multi-million-dollar house of cards completely collapsed into the dirt. My mother reached over and took my hand, squeezing it gently, breaking me out of my thoughtful reverie. She did not need to say a single word. The immense pride shining brightly in her eyes told me everything I ever needed to know. We had survived the devastating storm. We had faced down the ultimate corporate bully, and we had decisively won, simply by refusing to surrender our fundamental dignity. If you have ever been belittled by your family or your superiors for your quiet contributions, please remember that your value does not lie in their judgment. Be brave and stand up and let your abilities speak for themselves. If you feel satisfied with how justice was served in this story, please like and subscribe to the channel to support me. Do not forget to leave a comment sharing which state you are watching this video from and at what time. See you in the next stories.